There are places on this planet where human laws do not apply. We like to believe that civilization travels with us, that the social contracts we sign in cities and suburbs extend to the edges of the map, but they don't. When you sail past the horizon, you enter a space where survival is the only currency and morality is a luxury that some people cannot afford. If you are out there and you have something someone else needs to survive, the line between neighbor and predator dissolves. The Pacific Ocean is the largest empty space on Earth. In the center of it, 1,000 miles south of Hawaii, lies a speck of land called Palmyra Atoll. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, a ring of coral and lush jungle surrounding a turquoise lagoon, but it is also a place with a dark gravity. Sailors have avoided it for centuries, whispering about strange currents, unexplainable shipwrecks, and an atmosphere that feels heavy, watchful, and hostile. In 1974, two couples arrived at Palmyra. Only one couple came back, and they came back on the wrong boat. To understand the horror of what happened on Palmyra, you first have to understand the dream that led Mac and Muff Graham to their deaths. Malcolm Allen Mac Graham was 43, a successful business executive who had spent his life meticulously planning for an escape. He wasn't running from the law. He was running toward freedom. He wanted to leave the noise of the modern world behind. His wife, Eleanor, known to everyone as Muff, was his partner in every sense. She was 40, capable, intelligent, and shared Mac's longing for the quiet of the open ocean. They spent years searching for the perfect vessel. They found it in the Seawind. It was a 38-foot ketch, a sailboat of exceptional quality. Mac spent 2 years outfitting it with the best equipment money could buy. It wasn't more than a boat. It was a floating fortress of comfort and self-reliance. It had a workshop, a darkroom for photography, ample food stores, and redundant systems for safety. It was their home, and it was the envy of anyone who saw it. In June of 1974, they set sail from Hawaii, looking for a place where they could be completely alone for a few months before continuing their voyage around the world. They chose Palmyra specifically because it was uninhabited. They wanted solitude. But when the Seawind glided through the narrow channel into the lagoon of Palmyra, the Grahams realized their mistake. They were not alone. Another boat was already anchored in the calm waters. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming, well-maintained Seawind. This boat, named the Iola, was a disaster. It was a ferro-cement sloop that was rotting from the inside out. It was poorly built, stripped of essential gear, and barely seaworthy. On board the Iola were Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns. If Mac and Muff were the picture of prepared, responsible sailors, Buck and Stearns were the dark reflection. Buck Walker was an ex-con, a man with a violent history and a fugitive warrant hanging over his head for drug trafficking. He was running from a prison sentence. Stephanie was his girlfriend, a younger woman from a good family who had been swept up in Walker's chaotic orbit. They had fled Hawaii in a panic, on a boat that had no business being in the open ocean. By the time they limped into Palmyra, they were desperate. They were low on food, they had no working engine, they were trapped. The dynamic on the island was established immediately. You had the Grahams on one side, wealthy, stocked with filet mignon and fine wine, possessing a boat that could sail anywhere in the world. On the other side, you had Walker and Stearns, starving, desperate, owning a boat that was essentially a floating coffin. In a city, this disparity is managed by laws and distance. On a deserted atoll a mile long, it is a recipe for catastrophe. At first, the interactions were civil, masked by the etiquette of the sea. Sailors help sailors. Mac and Muff were wary, but they were decent people. They invited Walker and Stearns aboard the Seawind for dinner. They shared supplies, but the tension was immediate. Mac Graham was an experienced man. He knew trouble when he saw it. He radioed friends back in Hawaii mentioning the hippies on the other boat. He described Walker as an expert mechanic who was trying to fix the Iola's broken generator. But Mac also noted that he didn't trust him. He told his friends that he slept with a pistol under his pillow. The atmosphere on Palmyra in the summer of 1974 was oppressive. The atoll is not a tropical paradise in the traditional sense. It receives nearly 200 inches of rain a year. It is hot, humid, and teeming with aggressive wildlife. The lagoon is infested with gray reef sharks that are known to be territorial. The land crabs are the size of dinner plates. The insects are relentless. It is a place that wears you down. For the Grahams, it was supposed to be an adventure. For Walker and Stearns, it was a prison. Walker tried to cultivate a friendship with Mac, but it was transactional. He needed things. He needed parts for his generator. He needed food. But most of all, he needed a way off the island. The Iola had run aground on the coral heads, entering the lagoon, damaging its hull. It was taking on water. Walker knew, and Mac knew, that the Iola was never leaving Palmyra. The escalation was slow and psychological. Walker and Stearns had brought dogs with large, untrained animals that roamed the small islets of the atoll, hunting birds and snarling at the Grahams. Mac loved nature. He was disturbed by the dogs tearing apart the local wildlife. It was a small friction point, but it grew. The Grahams began to retreat, spending more time on the sea wind, pulling up the ladder at night. They established a routine of radio contact with a grid of ham radio operators in Hawaii. Every Wednesday and Sunday, Mac would check in. His voice was the only tether to the civilized world. By August, the situation had become critical. Walker and Stearns were out of food. They were living on coconuts and whatever fish they could catch, but the fish in the lagoon were often toxic with ciguatera poison. They were starving. They looked across the water at the sea wind, glowing with electric lights, smelling of cooking meat, a vessel capable of freedom. It is easy to imagine the conversations that happened in the dark, damp cabin of the Iola, the envy, the rationalization, the idea that life isn't fair and that survival belongs to the strong. On August 28, 1974, Mac Graham made his scheduled radio call. He sounded normal. He mentioned that they were planning to stay on Palmyra a while longer before heading to Fanning Island. He said the weather was clearing. He signed off, promising to call again in 3 days. 3 days later, the radio was silent. The operators in Hawaii called out for the sea wind. There was no answer. They tried again the next day, and the next. Silence. In October 1974, a boat sailed into the harbor at Alawai in Honolulu. It was a beautiful ketch, freshly painted a clumsy lavender color. The name on the hull had been painted over. It was now registered as the Iola, but it wasn't the Iola. The harbor master and other sailors noticed immediately. You can paint a boat, but you can't change its lines. You can't hide the craftsmanship of a vessel like the Sea Wind. The couple on board, Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns, seemed relieved to be back. They told a story to anyone who asked. They said that while they were on Palmyra, the Grahams had invited them for a fishing trip on the Sea Wind. They said the dinghy had overturned and the Grahams had fallen into the shark-infested waters and vanished. They claimed they searched for days but found nothing. Distraught, and with their own boat wrecked, they decided to sail the Sea Wind back to Hawaii to return it to the Grahams' estate. It was a lie that fell apart under the slightest scrutiny. Friends of the Grahams recognized the boat instantly. The repainting was hasty and amateurish. Inside, the Grahams' personal effects were still there, but mixed with Walker's belongings. The authorities moved in. Walker and Stearns were arrested. However, there was a problem, a massive legal problem. There were no bodies. In 1974, without a body, it was incredibly difficult to prove murder. The defense could argue that the Grahams had indeed died in an accident, or that they had simply sailed away on another boat, or that they were living in hiding. Without physical evidence of death, the prosecution was stuck. Walker and Stearns were charged with the theft of the boat. Walker, being a fugitive, was sent back to prison on his drug charges and given an additional sentence for the theft. Stearns was convicted of theft as well, but the question of murder hung in the air like a heavy fog. Everyone knew. The sailing community knew. The police knew. Mac and Muff Graham had not drowned in a fishing accident. They had been erased. For 6 years, the mystery remained. Palmyra sat silent in the Pacific, holding its secrets. The jungle grew over the remains of the Iola, which Walker had scuttled in the lagoon before leaving. The Grahams were legally declared dead, but the lack of closure tormented their families. Then came 1981. The ocean, which usually keeps what it takes, decided to give something back. Another sailing couple, the Jordans, visited Palmyra. They were aware of the legends, the Sea Wind murders, but the atoll's beauty was a siren song. One afternoon, Sharon Jordan was walking along a remote stretch of beach on the lagoon side. It was an area dense with scrub brush and fallen coconuts. As she walked, she saw something glinting in the sand near the water's edge. It was a vintage aluminum container, a square metal box that looked like it had been there for years. The box had likely been underwater, trapped in the coral, and a recent storm had dislodged it, washing it ashore. Nature had intervened. Sharon approached the box. It was tightly wired shut. It looked like military surplus, something from World War II, which was common on the island. But when she looked closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A bone was protruding from the container. She called for her husband. They pried the lid open. Inside, they found a human skull. It was charred, blackened by fire. Along with the skull were other bone fragments and a woman's watch. The watch had stopped. The authorities were flown in. The remains were sent to a forensic lab in Hawaii. The dental records confirmed what everyone already feared. The skull belonged to Muff Graham. The discovery of the skull changed everything. It wasn't just that they found her, it was the condition of the remains that told the story of her final moments. The science of the bones revealed a horror that went beyond simple murder. The skull showed signs of extreme heat. Muff Graham had been burned, but she hadn't just been burned. Her body had been dismembered and stuffed into that small aluminum container. The container was then wired shut and thrown into the lagoon. The perpetrators had relied on the weight of the box and the depth of the lagoon to hide the crime forever. They hadn't counted on the aluminum resisting corrosion or the currents shifting the box 7 years later. But the forensic analysis revealed something else, something even chilling. There was a hole in the skull. It wasn't a bullet hole. It was a ragged impact fracture. The experts concluded that Muff Graham had been beaten, likely with a heavy object, before or during the burning. The timeline was reconstructed. The theory that emerged was one of calculated brutality. Prosecutors believed that Buck Walker had decided to take the Seawind. To do that, he had to eliminate the owners. The Grahams were likely separated. Mac was perhaps shot or killed first. His body has never been found. Muff was then executed. The finding of the box allowed the state to charge Buck Walker with murder. Stephanie Stearns was also charged. The trials that followed were a descent into the psychology of sociopathy. Buck Walker's defense was absurd. He claimed he and Stephanie were making love in their tent when they heard screams. He said they found the dinghy overturned and the Grahams gone. He couldn't explain the box. He couldn't explain why he repainted the boat. He couldn't explain the total lack of grief or effort to contact the Coast Guard. He was convicted of murder in 1985. He was a man who believed that if no one saw it, it didn't happen. He underestimated the persistence of the truth. Stephanie Stearns was defended by a high-profile lawyer, Vincent Bugliosi, the man who prosecuted Charles Manson. Her defense was that she was a victim too, controlled by Walker, unaware of the murder, believing his lies. She painted herself as a naive girl caught in a nightmare. The jury believed her, or at least they couldn't find enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she participated in the killing itself. She was acquitted of murder. To this day, there are those who doubt her innocence. They ask how you can live on a tiny boat with a man who just butchered 2 people, watch him repaint their stolen vessel, and not ask questions. They ask how she could wear Muff Graham's clothes, which were found in her possession, and not know. Buck Walker died in 2000. He maintained his innocence to the end, spinning yarns about government conspiracies and drug deals gone wrong. He never showed remorse. Matt Graham's body remains lost to the Pacific, likely weighted down in the deep waters outside the reef. The horror of the Seawind murders isn't just the violence, it's the isolation. It's the realization of how fragile our safety really is. Mac and Muff Graham did everything right. They were prepared, they were cautious, they were kind. But they made the mistake of going to a place where there was no one to hear them scream. When you look at photos of Palmyra Atoll, it looks like paradise. But sailors who go there now say it feels different. They say the wind in the palms sounds different there. They say you can feel eyes on you from the jungle. The Seawind was eventually returned to the Graham family, but the memory of what happened on that deck stains the history of the cruising community. It forces us to ask a question we don't want to answer. When society is stripped away, when there are no police, no cameras, and no witnesses, who are we? Are we the Grahams trying to share our table? Or are we the ones watching from the dark, waiting for the fire to die down, sharpening a knife? The ocean is vast, and it is indifferent. It hides things. But sometimes, as with the aluminum box on the shore of Palmyra, it refuses to keep a secret. It spits the truth back out, just to remind us that nothing stays buried forever.